U.S. China bilateral relationship, economic policy, trade relations. Our final panel for this morning is going to dive into what are the challenges and opportunities of doing business in China, and will also provide some strategic guidance on how to navigate the Chinese market. So please join me in welcoming our moderator, Aaron Starks, Chief Revenue Officer at World Trade Center, Utah, Craig Allen, President of the U.S. China Business Council, Sarah Kemp, VP of International Government Affairs at Intel, and Chris Campbell, Chief Strategist at Kroll.
I think we had the best music. That was pretty good. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. We've been fed. This has been an incredible opportunity over the past couple of days to engage on a great topic. All of us have interest in China. All of us are impacted by China in various ways. The title of this panel is Business Intelligence for Navigating China. That's just a fancy way of saying what makes China a global destination for businesses right now. And so I want to break that out, and hopefully as we have a discussion, we can answer a few questions. One, what's happening in China right now? Okay, amidst of a global pandemic, supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. Two, what opportunities exist for Utah companies exploring China as a market? And three, what are the risks associated with those decisions? I'm joined by a wonderful panel. We have Craig here, President of the U.S. China Business Council. Craig, thank you for coming to Utah. We have Sarah Kemp, who's Vice President of Global International Affairs from Intel. Intel's an incredible organization that we all know. Then we have Chris Campbell, who's Chief Strategist at Kroll. So we're going to take the conversation from a broad approach. Let's start at 30,000 feet to begin with. Craig, if you don't mind, I'm going to put you on the spot here. In light of the challenges that we've all experienced over the past 3 years, a global pandemic being one of them, supply chains, the zero COVID policy, what's happening from a macroeconomic standpoint in China?
Sure, terrific. Well, thank you very much, Aaron. And I'd like to take a second to thank the university and its wonderful president, and also the World Trade Center. It's a real honor to be here. I would say that from a microeconomic perspective, U.S. exports and U.S. companies have in fact been doing very well in China, despite all of the political headwinds. So you don't have to believe me, the numbers speak for themselves. U.S. exports to China last year increased 21% to a record. The year before that, 17%. So over the last 2 years, U.S. exports to China have increased almost 40%. That's a really good showing by any metric. I would say Utah is an export powerhouse as well. About $1 billion worth of exports, about 7,000 Utah residents employed in exporting to China. And I'm sure that that could be increased very significantly as the industries that you're working in are very much consumer-driven and very, very welcome in China. In addition, again, from the microeconomic perspective, American investment in China has been increasing as well. The numbers are not as clear, but we had probably a 15-20% increase in American investment last year. And I agree with the previous speaker that the Phase 1 agreement helped that, but really more fundamentally, last year's 8% growth in the Chinese economy drove a lot of imports into the market. As we look at this, it's kind of hard to talk about all companies or all exports. What I would say is that in a number of areas, it's a green light, full speed ahead. Consumer goods, consumer services, such as travel and education, energy and agriculture. There are no barriers here. There's no national security concerns whatsoever. In a little bit less certain, but still extremely bullish and moving ahead very rapidly, are industrials, petrochemicals, automotive. Life sciences are a little bit more complex, but also moving ahead. And all the problems that we've heard about are more constrained within certain industries, be it high tech or aerospace and telecom, a few other areas. But generally speaking, let's not take the difficulties over tech and assume that those same difficulties prevail over all the economy. That's not true. In consumer goods, meat, where Utah is doing very well. In travel and education, where Utah is doing very well. In cosmetics and dietary supplements, where Utah is a superstar. It's a wide open and free market, and I'd encourage Utah companies to explore.
I love what you said. Many of you may or may not know this, but 40% of the freight in the United States flows through the state of Utah, which literally means that we are the crossroads of the West. We have the I-15 and I-80 exchange. That corridor allows free-flowing freight. We've got a very robust inland port initiative taking place right now. So Utah companies are positioned to perform on the worldwide stage, and that's great. But as we look at China, and I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit more here. Why would we continue to look at China given that there are supply chain disruptions? What are the risks associated? If you were to sit down with a Utah company today, what would you advise them on?
Okay, so why China? Well, China's the largest importer in the world. So if you want to be sell to the largest importer in the world, well, that's a good place to start. China, over the last 15, 20 years, has produced as much as 30% of global growth. In 2022, they'll produce about $1 trillion of extra growth. So if you want to go to where the growth is, well, consider China as a good opportunity. Also, there have been, tens of thousands of American companies that have been very successful there and continue to manage the stresses and strains very well. Yeah, it's a challenge. Every day waking up is a challenge, but one can manage that and manage the difficulties of doing business in China. In most areas, tech, again, aerospace, more complex, more difficult challenges, but in consumer goods and meat, education, services, the water's warm. Please jump in.
I love that. Thank you, Craig, for letting me put you on the spot there. Largest consumer market in the world. And you look at direct-to-consumer businesses. Here's an interesting way to look at this. 10 years ago, Uber didn't exist. Instagram didn't exist. Robinhood didn't exist. These are all billion-dollar organizations that have emerged over the past 10 years. So China is definitely a market of consideration for anybody who wants to sell consumer goods or SaaS product. I want Intel's perspective on this, Sarah, though. As we talk about a zero COVID policy, hey, help us understand what that means. What is zero COVID policy, and what has that done for supply chains?
Yeah, no, and I think some of the previous speakers have already touched on this. But what it meant was that Shanghai, and let's talk about Shanghai for a minute, the lockdown of Shanghai. What did that do? Shanghai accounts for 20% of China's foreign trade. It's the busiest port in the world, and for the last 12 years, it's rated #1 in terms of throughput of containers, right? So you shut down Shanghai, you shut down that port for an extended period of time. China sneezes, we all get the flu a little bit, right? Like, I guess the upside is the Port of Long Beach probably got to get all their, their backlog. Hopefully they've dealt with it, is the upside. I hope. But what did that cause? What were some of the impacts? Well, Apple, in its 10K, said if you look at the next quarter, the supply chain constraints caused by the shutdown could be a $4 billion impact for Apple, right? Tesla lost a month's worth of production due to the shutdown. Hynix, which supplies Apple, said the lockdown had the biggest impact. And that why? Because the port, when you looked at it, it had 175% increase in container dwell time in March. And that was up from March was 175 and April was even higher. So ships are waiting longer to get loaded. What does that tell me? That tells me that it's not just the shipping, it's the trucking, it's getting to the port. And I would say we also, experience challenges in terms of just moving product. 70% of all of your laptops went through Shanghai in their creation. So it has a huge impact, a huge, huge impact. And in fact, the AmCham in Beijing did a survey of their members, and 61% of them said that the supply chain disruption was a serious problem, specifically the Shanghai lockdown. So it's been a huge impact.
I love that. Thank you. I also want to jump over to Chris here. Chris, you have great experience, and for our Utah audience here, Chris, former chief of staff for our beloved Senator Hatch. Great to have you back in the state. He's agreed to do an interpretive dance on what's happening with China here, just to mix things up.
After you. Yeah.
But let's touch on the financial sector a little bit. The last report I read showed that China was number 4 worldwide for FDI receiving. That obviously covers a number of industries and sectors and so forth. Given what's happened with Hong Kong and China, how do you see that affecting financial markets down the road? And also, is Hong Kong still a viable financial sector for us as we look at investments in the future?
Yeah, it's excellent. First of all, it's incredibly great to be back in Utah. Any opportunity to come back, it's wonderful, and I know we all regrettably now miss the former Senator Hatch, the late Senator Hatch. Anyway, thanks for the invitation, and thank you so much for your hospitality. Look, Hong Kong is presenting a real challenge. I think what wasn't mentioned, I used to be Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury under the former administration prior to going into private practice. And now I help run large financial firms and many companies. And one thing I've learned is that you can kind of step back, and when you're in the real economy, and you hear what the Democrats and Republicans are saying, irrespective if you were a policy before or not, if they agree on something, listen. Right, so if you hear Nick Burns and the former deputy director of the National Security Council of the Trump administration agreeing on China, that's a real challenge. And it's going to present a real challenge for us in the private sector. So that's just a reality, right? Fortunate or not, we in the private practice and the people who create companies, we have to respond to the coming challenges. Yes, there's no question that there's been an enormous amount of FDI flow, but again, from my Department of Treasury's perspective, the U.S. has the largest and most robust financial institution sector and a network of the entire world, which is why it's actually genuinely why the sanctions we've opposed with our partners against Russia have been so effective. This is a coming threat. China has now digitized the renminbi to try to get around them, as did Russia. But again, all significant problems. Let's step away from the policy and just recognize that there are challenges ahead, which means there's going to be supply chain challenges and other things that the businesses are going to have to respond to. Hong Kong, regrettably, again, hearing it from both sides of the aisle. I remember when the UK surrendered Hong Kong to China. China made a commitment for a long-term one China, two policies. That didn't last very long, right? So now, go to Hong Kong and try to present a unique or a different position than Beijing. You're going to run into some real challenges really quickly. These are the same things that non-government businesses have to work on. So I think that was one of our previous speakers suggested some of the unique zigs and zags of the Chinese market. The stock market has done. Hong Kong used to be a worldwide center for finance, but now, because of the challenges that China has had in the past, it presents unique issues. But now in business, every problem has a private sector solution, and it's up to us to innovate and try to find creative ways around it. And so, and that's what I do. That's what I do today, and help so many companies out in that process. So again, massive challenges, but for every challenge, there are unique opportunities. And American ingenuity and American innovation is the best in the entire planet. And I know for a fact that we will innovate around our way around this and try and solve these problems in a way that I think will lift all boats.
Innovation is a great segue into the next question. And I'm going to stay with you, Chris, and then I'd like to jump back to Craig and get your thoughts on this. But I recently became aware of a term called the Silicon Shield. And that's a term applied to Taiwan because of its manufacturing capabilities with semiconductor technology, microchips, et cetera, implying that they're protected because of those, because of Foxconn's success, and et cetera. How does the U.S. respond to those capabilities being housed in Taiwan? What does that mean for us? And maybe what does that mean for a prospective company identifying two markets, one in Taiwan and one in China? What would you say to that company?
Yeah, for those who don't know, Silicon Shield is a kind of a fancy way of saying because there's so many semiconductors being created in Taiwan that effectively it so ties us, so closely economically ties us to Taiwan that we will absolutely have to respond militarily should China do something against Taiwan. And until or unless that there's a divorce or a breakup of that strong economic tie, Taiwan is ensured their protection with the United States government. I would also suggest that, in fact, what many of you don't know is Senator Hatch actually was the author of an act that's now a law called the Taiwan Relations Act that suggests and puts any advance on Taiwan militarily as an advance to the United States. We must defend them as if we would defend ourselves. And that's still an existing law in the books of the United States of America. And interestingly, when in government, when I would travel to China many times, both with and without Senator Hatch, I never did one meeting. And I've done hundreds of meetings in China officially. I never did one meeting in China if I was with the dog catcher or with the premier or vice premier, where the meeting did not begin and end with Taiwan. Not one. Literally not one. And so it's certainly a matter of significant national pride and source of issue for them. I believe that we've heard from, again, bipartisanly from our national leaders that it remains a big issue, and it's certainly front and center with the current premier. But again, stepping back a bit, and not to monopolize the entire conversation, but there's massive moves now happening in the United States with some bipartisan acts moving their way through Congress and some other things that will really energize and kind of effectively if it were on life support, really kind of resuscitate it. The national chip manufacturing capabilities in the United States, where there's going to be an enormous amount of U.S. dollars and efforts in the U.S. government to make sure that we actually now renationalize that in ways that will not make us non-dependent, effectively non-dependent from any foreign source of chips in the future.
I just have to
Please jump in, yeah.
Because you're singing my song here. What I find so exciting about being particularly in the semiconductor industry at this particular moment in time is that economic security is national security, and around the world, people have realized that means chips. Why? Because this tiny little thing that's the size of a postage stamp, that's thinner than one strand of hair, that has over 30 billion components to it, drives everything you do from the moment you wake up in the morning, hopefully, and get out of bed in a good mood, right? Your watch, your phone, to satellites, to missiles. Everything we do, electric vehicle car takes 2,500 chips, right? It's part of the reason we had some of the chip shortage. But what we're seeing around the world is when I go to capitals, so capitals around the world, I have these discussions. What are governments doing? Because they want to attract part of the supply chain or this ecosystem, because the ecosystem is very complicated. Most of the designers are in the U.S. The people that make the machines are in Holland, are Dutch or Japan. Yes, a lot of the manufacturing is in Asia, 70%. But now, the CHIPS Act in the U.S., fabulous. Intel has committed $52 billion to new manufacturing in the United States. We've doubled down in Ohio, Arizona, we've doubled down in Oregon. But we're seeing this around the world. We also, in Germany, you know, the EU is putting a CHIPS Act together that similarly is going to attract investment for production in Europe. So we also see that Japan and India are putting CHIPS Acts together because people have realized, I akin it to, so what steel and railroads were in the 1900s, chips and data are right now. And every single country around the world wants to get in on that game and that next leap in economic vitality. So I think it's a fabulous time to be in. I'm so thrilled to see what I hope is going to be a bipartisan support quickly passed bill to really help us regain. The U.S. used to have 57% of the chip manufacturing. It's now down at 12. My CEO has a vision to bring it back and is doing it by really looking at the U.S. and Europe as a little bit of a pivot to how do we, you know, sort of diversify the supply chain of chips. So I think it's very exciting. Sorry, I just had to jump in there.
No, that's
Sorry.
great. That's great.
Sorry, Craig, over to you.
Over to you, Craig.
Taiwan?
Oh, yeah.
There was a lot covered there. Let's start with Taiwan, yeah.
Okay, so again, looking at this from a microeconomic perspective, Taiwan is a great market, and I would encourage Utah companies to really explore. I served on Taiwan for 4 years and have tremendous respect. But it's not an either-or. If you're looking at this as a company, you could do very well in both markets. I would note, I would echo Chris's comments. This is an extremely sensitive issue between the straits, between Taipei and Beijing. And indeed, it's one that we have to approach very, very carefully. 50 years ago, Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai made an agreement on Taiwan that was very difficult to reach. And I think it's fair to say that under the previous administration and continuing in this administration, there's been a departure from that agreement, most recently as exemplified by a formal discussion by the Secretary of Commerce and Taiwan's Minister of Economic Affairs. And we need to be careful about this and thoughtful about, most importantly, the people of Taiwan, but also that this doesn't become a self-fulfilling prophecy of conflict, because that conflict, if that were to ever happen, would be devastating to everyone in this room and everyone that we know and beyond that. So this is a risk factor that we need to keep in mind because we can't necessarily control that, but we can influence it through our Taiwan policy, and we need to approach that in a wise manner. And I would argue, keep our commitments, keep the commitments that were made 50 years ago. A great country keeps its commitments, and I think that is a good starting point.
Thank you. Great input on two very important topics, supply chains, logistics, how that's impacting manufacturing of semiconductors, but then two very viable markets between Taipei and Beijing. Great markets, great people, and as a Utah company, what we want you to do is do your due diligence. Spread your risk. Don't jump into a market without first understanding what the cultural implications are, what the economic implications are, what policies are in place to help you be successful in a foreign market. What are the regulatory or compliance hurdles that you're going to face? We want you to do your due diligence and be very thorough about it. There are a lot of great markets around the world, and certainly Taipei and Beijing are two of them. And so with that being said, I know we're a little bit behind schedule, but I'm going to give you each just 30 seconds just to share some closing remarks, and then we'll conclude. Chris, let's start with you.
God, I knew you would do that. I think I think lunch is next. So let me just say it this way. I am so incredibly humbled and honored to have been invited to speak to you guys. I'm so incredibly happy to see that there are so many people paying attention to this incredibly important topic. It obviously it shows and demonstrates just how interconnected our economies are, and how much business is driving this discussion. I urge you to stay connected to those leaders that are in charge, and thank you again so much to the university and World Trade Center for the invitation. It's just incredibly great to see so many great friends and faces in the audience, and I hope you really enjoy your lunch.
Yeah. I'm just going to pick up on something you said. First, I also want to extend my thanks, but I also want to thank the luminaries in this room. What I did in my career, I did because there are people that came before me, and I stood on the shoulders of giants. And you have many of them in the room and on this stage with me, whether it's Craig, whether it's Lou, whether it's Tim Stratford, Ambassador Huntsman. But really, I also want to thank each and every one of you for showing up and coming and trying to learn more, to the point of learn it, dig in. It is complex, and it is not just one thing. China is as complicated as it gets. It's as high-tech and as low-tech, and it's not monolithic, even within a ministry. So the ministry that controls or regulates your industry, it's not going to be monolithic when you talk to different people. There is not just one line of thought. Understand on a personal level who you're sitting across from, what drives them. Know the landscape. And to do that, I would argue, you need to broaden your set of advisors beyond your company. I'm not endorsing any particular one, even though Carl's up here, but I would just say, broaden your data points. Talk to everyone you can. Talk to the chamber, talk to the council, talk to everyone you can, because it is so complicated. And yes, let's go to lunch, but I know we have to.
Let me just say in closing that Nick Burns, Ambassador Burns, was absolutely right, that this is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. And indeed, the global innovation ecosystem and our children's welfare will be determined by how well we manage this situation. And it's extremely tense right now on a political, on a geostrategic level. And let me argue that business has a very important role to play, a positive role, in providing the ballast of the relationship, of providing jobs to our communities, of increasing understanding, and I will argue in increasing and improving human rights in China through our presence, through our investments and our trade in China. Business plays a remarkably positive and constructive role within this relationship ever since 1784, when the first ship sailed out of New York Harbor. That is more true today than ever before. And I encourage all the business people in the audience to take a look at China and let us know if we can help.
Thank you. Let's go ahead.